I'm very sad that I can't be there in person. That was the plan, but as Gemma said, I've got COVID, so yeah, yet another plan scuppered by COVID there. But still, it's good to be here, albeit virtually, to talk about this chapter that we co-authored, myself, Liz, and Gemma, representing diverse genders in sports media, the discursive construction of cisgenderism in the UK press. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the chapter and then think briefly at the end about some of the ways that some of the things that we talk about in the chapter kind of apply to some more sort of current events, I suppose. So this chapter was actually developed from part of my PhD work, which Liz and Gemma were my supervisors for. And the aim of this bit of work was to kind of develop a sort of an understanding of the broad brushstrokes of the conversation around trans, intersex, and non-binary sports people in the media. And just say quickly, I saw someone mentioned in the chat about using the term DSD, and just say that in this case, we do often use the term intersex in large part because that's what the media was using, and it's kind of necessary in order to collect the data and to sort of capture that data in many ways. And so we're focused on this concept of cisgenderism, just the ideology that denies, denigrates, pathologizes identities that don't adhere to sort of cisgender expectations. And it was because we were focused on that cisgenderist ideology that we did include trans, non-binary, and intersex or DSD representations in the media that makes up the data set of this chapter, because when thinking about cisgenderist ideology, we were kind of also interested in thinking about the way that the kind of, a web of discrimination is kind of created and legitimized around, different, non-cisgender identities. So for the chapter, we collected articles from UK national newspapers, and we felt that, even though social media and things like that are potentially more prevalent nowadays, national newspapers are a good way to kind of understand some of the sort of dominant narratives around a topic, which is what we were trying to do here. And so we ended up with 183 articles, the majority of which were related to trans inclusion in sport, but there were 45 articles that talked about intersex inclusion in sport. And then we only had 7 articles related to non-binary inclusion in sport, and all of those 7 were kind of sort of tangentially related to sport in many ways. So because of that, we don't necessarily talk about non-binary inclusion in the chapter that much, except for to kind of acknowledge and think about the kind of lack of visibility in the media that shows up in the data set. And so most of the articles came from sort of 2010 onwards or so, and a lot of them from sort of the kind of 5 years leading up to 2019 when we did the data collection. But we did have articles ranging from as early as 1996 up till the day of collection on 20th of March 2019. And our approach to the analysis involved discursive psychology, which Liz mentioned earlier at the beginning, which basically we were kind of foregrounding how ideologies are kind of produced and situated in in language. And we did use a reflexive thematic analysis as the kind of analytical framework. So we were really looking for patterns of shared meaning across the articles in relation to cisgenderism. And from that thematic analysis, then we develop 3 themes in this chapter that capture the way that the media portrays these various non-cisgender identities: unnatural athletic bodies, contested rights, and deviation signals. Deviancy, which I'll sort of give a brief summary of here, and then, as I say, look at kind of the applications of this to some more current events. So the first thing then, unnatural athletic bodies, really looks at how scientific and kind of medicalized discourse and language is used in the reportage that we looked at to construct what counts as natural and what counts as unnatural, right? And then therefore what is kind of normalized in the sporting kind of space. And importantly to note, it's not necessarily about refuting physiological sciences as such, although obviously critical engagement with them is important, but here it was more about understanding how scientific language is used rhetorically in the media to present certain cisgenderist claims as empirically evident and objectively true, and therefore kind of make them harder to challenge in certain ways. And so we saw this happen differently for trans and intersex or DSD athletes. So, for example, there's a quote here that you can see how these intersex characteristics are described as sort of genital ambiguities. The scientists are kind of presented as sort of knowledge holders, I suppose, around DSD or intersex identities. In this quote, they even go as far as to kind of describe those characteristics as almost like a physiological malformation, almost. This is the result of toxicity in the environment. And in effect, then, this kind of functions to produce an intersex identity in the media that's fully conceived of in kind of medicalized terms. And in so doing, not only does it remove kind of important social identity, facets of those identities, but it also kind of justifies or seeks to justify kind of medical intervention into healthy bodies, which is framed as a kind of rectifying biological anomalies, as it were, which is something that is stipulated in some sporting regulations. In contrast to that, trans women athletes, and also I should note that we are really just talking about trans women athletes here, because all of the media is really just focused on people competing in women's sports. So trans women athletes are regularly kind of misgendered and objectified by this kind of scientific and medicalized discourse, with in effect a kind of an imagined biological core, sort of presented as I said before, kind of empirically evident, and in this case used as kind of what is claimed to be kind of indisputable proof, almost, of what is really a male identity kind of thing that's at odds with there being a woman and competing in women's sports as they construct it there. So what we're trying to get at then really is the way that constructing what counts as natural and unnatural in these cases is used to kind of delegitimize and pathologize these athletes, in different but connected ways here. The second theme that we look at in the chapter of contested rights focuses on how kind of marginalized rights, or I should say the kind of rights of certain marginalized groups, can be played off against each other. So that might be the positioning of sort of binary trans and non-binary trans athletes in a certain way that kind of delegitimizes one or both at different times. But predictably, the more common one in the media that we looked at was the positioning of trans and cis women as kind of in conflict, and their rights as sort of incompatible in many ways. So, for example, there was a quote here that talks about a couple of different sporting events. So firstly, you've got a 15-year-old trans athlete who's presented in highly kind of misgendering and objectifying ways, talking about male anatomy and stubble, to present them as kind of unfairly competing in women's sports. And then second, you've got this report of a mixed martial arts fight between Fallon Fox, a trans woman, and Tamika Brents, a cis woman, in 2014. And the description of that kind of works to, in a way, literally and figuratively position trans women as almost attacking cis women's and cis sportswomen's rights. And so this is produced, I think, quite notably, for example, in the description of Fallon Fox as a mixed martial arts competitor, and the foregrounding of her transition, which contrasts with, for example, the description of Brent, who's explicitly described as female, and then isn't even really coded as an MMA fighter in the same way that Fox is, really. And so the result of that is that the fight is kind of presented in this article as one you know, you've got one trans mixed martial artist who's kind of in many ways denied her womanhood, and then one woman who isn't even really explicitly presented as an MMA fighter. And so then when they describe the injuries that Brent sustains, this concussion and a broken eye socket, which aren't necessarily that uncommon in combat sports, you know, they can and do happen, but they're reported on here in a way that kind of symbolizes this positioning of trans and cis sportswomen's rights as in conflict, and you know, cis women and cis women's rights as under attack from trans sports people. And the final theme in the chapter that we look at, we kind of look at how these descriptions of these non-cisgender athletes are really intertwined with lots of kind of moral and ethical judgment and suspicion in many ways. And this is a kind of cisgenderist discourse that we see very commonly and is kind of quite easily produced and regularly accepted in sporting context, because for multiple reasons, but one common way was that testosterone and the kind of focus on testosterone turns testosterone into a kind of almost like symbolic of cheating. So when you think of the quintessential kind of cheating athlete in sports, the kind of doping athlete, testosterone is the kind of you know, held up as the proof of their cheating often, at least, you know, in the media it is, and in kind of lay discourse. And then, you know, it's the same for what has been perceived of and presented as gender fraud in sporting spaces, which is a discourse that you know, trans and kind of non-cisgender athletes are regularly subjected to. So in effect, there's a kind of interdiscursivity that's, you know, easily produced in a way in sporting discourse between trans and kind of doping athletes, and we can see that, for example, in this quote, which is from an article about trans inclusion in sports, and it describes trans women's testosterone as having performance enhancing effects, which is a phrase is obviously very heavily associated with sort of, you know, steroid use and not performance enhancing drugs, obviously. And so this is an example of what is often a kind of more explicit and often more kind of aggressive association between you know, trans athletes and cheating athletes, or, you know, specifically doping athletes, which kind of functions in the media to establish trans women as kind of you know, like deliberately cheating in the same way that doping athletes do, or are imagined to do in many ways. The other thing just to note, I guess, on this, the kind of the discourse, the kind of ethical and kind of moral discourses, is that description of Fox's MMA fight. So let's go back to, in many ways, instead of it reading like a description of a kind of sanctioned sporting event between kind of two, you know, highly skilled, consenting athletes, it reads in many ways like a kind of, you know, description of like an unsanctioned non-sporting event, like some kind of brawl, or like even kind of domestic abuse, potentially something like that, which really kind of points to the way that the kind of moral judgments that are ascribed to athletes who deviate from cisgender expectations in the media aren't just confined to sort of sporting discourses and this idea of, you know, potentially falling afoul of sporting regulations and sporting rules, but they actually draw on discourses of much more kind of egregious, kind of immoral, and even, you know, illegal behavior is the kind of implication in those instances in the media. So summing up those themes that we talk about then in the chapter, you know, we talk about what counts as natural and unnatural, and therefore normal and, you know, abnormal is anything but natural, right? It's actively and creatively produced in the media to delegitimize non-cisgender athletes often. And we also saw how marginalized groups of athletes were often played off against each other, as well as against, you know, as I said, cisgender women, who, I guess, you know, it's important to note is, you know, sport is itself often kind of marginalized compared to, you know, men's sports a lot of the time. And then finally, as I was just talking about, you know, deviating from cisgender expectations is often intertwined with kind of moral and ethical suspicion of trans athletes. So that's a kind of summary, I guess, of the chapter, the things we talk about in the chapter. But as I said, the data collection was done in March 2019, which, so, you know, over 3 years ago, which is a fairly long time anyway, but particularly when you kind of adjust it for the 3 years that we've had, it feels like a much longer ago. So I just was thinking, I guess, about the kind of the media landscape today and how it kind of compared to the media that made up our data set, and how the things that we talk about kind of like apply now. And the first thing to highlight is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, you know, we don't really talk about non-binary athletes explicitly here that much, because there was very few articles and they were very kind of tangentially related to sports. So there was a real lack of visibility around non-binary sports people. But in contrast, in the last Summer and Winter Olympics Games, we had a handful of out and kind of visible non-binary athletes. So we had Alana Smith, skateboarder, we had Tuafila Duck, and we've also had Quinn, who are all now open non-binary Olympians, which is a big kind of shift from having the kind of real lack of visibility, the kind of lacuna of data and representation that we saw just, you know, even just a few years ago when we did the data collection. You know, of course, I guess visibility doesn't necessarily equal acceptance, but the kind of general, you know, when I had a look at the kind of reporting on these athletes, it's not quite as combative as you might expect, and it's not quite as combative as definitely compared to, for example, the media that made up the data in our chapter. And I think that also might have something to do with the fact that these athletes are still competing in their, you know, assigned at birth kind of category, and so it seems to be the case because the reporting on trans women's participation in women's sports in the last couple of years contains a lot of the same cisgenderist practices that we looked at in the chapter. Excuse me. So, for example, Laura Hubbard, the New Zealand weightlifter, competed at the Olympics. Has been subjected to a lot of these cisgenderist discourses in the reporting on her. And actually, since she competed in the Olympics, there's been a kind of, the reporting is kind of, I so often took on this kind of strange sort of double bind, an example of a strange double bind. You can see in this headline here, where the coverage kind of, the story sort of goes like, not only did she, you know, take the place of a cis woman, but, you know, she didn't even do very well. So she didn't even do anything for trans rights, which is, you know, obviously a can't win kind of situation, because doing well would have been used to discredit her as well. We also saw recently the US swimmer, college swimmer, I think Leah Thomas, who was subjected to quite a lot of well, pretty vitriolic kind of representations, and in the kind of reporting on her competing, we really saw a lot of these kinds of this positioning of trans and cis women's rights is positioned as you know, in a kind of incompatible zero-sum game sort of thing. And then also quite recently had coverage of Emily Bridges, the cyclist, and there was a lot of cisgenderist practices in the representations of her that I looked at as well. You know, quite a lot of coverage talks about how she, you know, had competed in men's races with pictures from those races, and often dead names from those races as well. So in the 3 years since the data in this chapter was collected, there is definitely been a growth in visibility for non-binary athletes and sports people, which is a real positive step. But it does seem that the same kind of cisgenderist discursive practices of discrediting and pathologizing trans athletes are still very present and seemingly even exacerbated for, you know, trans athletes who don't compete in their assigned at birth category. So just to summarize quickly then, in the chapter we explore how, you know, scientific, legal and moral discourses are used to kind of discredit non-cisgender athletes. And this is really made quite easy in sporting spaces and sporting discourses, which are basically, really obsessed with measuring and categorizing bodies in really rigid ways, as well as this kind of obsession with testosterone in many ways. And this has real significant impacts on sporting inclusion, which is in of itself, super important. But it also has impacts, I think, outside of sports. So I was kind of thinking of just a few weeks ago, I think it was like the day after they went back, the government went back on their decision to ban trans conversion therapy. We had Boris Johnson coming out and talking in real discriminatory ways about how trans women shouldn't be allowed to compete in women's sport, and in the same statement talking about exclusion in prisons and hospitals as well. And we see the same kind of oscillation between sport and other areas of life kind of across media coverage, really. And so for me, it kind of speaks to the easiness with which cisgenderism is expressed and accepted and legitimized in sporting spaces is often used to legitimize kind of prejudice in other areas of life as well. But then finally, I think there is some hope for challenging the cisgenderism in sport and in sports media that we look at here, because this need to constantly restabilize cisgender identities and a cisgender system through this kind of discriminatory cisgenderist discourse shows that it's actually not an inherently stable system of identities, and therefore it is susceptible to critique and challenge, such as you might find in this book. Okay, I'll stop talking then. Thank you very much for listening.